For our third anniversary, David planned the perfect surprise dinner at Pine Valley Mall. What I didn't expect was meeting his real love face to face. The moment Amanda shook my hand, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. She was wearing my grandmother's ring, the one I thought I lost 2 years ago. By the end of that night, I discovered David had a collection I never knew existed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and what I found in our basement changed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The restaurant buzzed with evening conversations and clinking silverware when David stood up from our corner table, his smile wider than I'd seen in months. We'd been celebrating quietly, sharing memories of our wedding day, and talking about maybe starting a family soon. The atmosphere felt warm and familiar until he waved someone over. Amanda Torres glided toward us like she belonged in our intimate celebration. Tall, elegant, with auburn hair that caught the restaurant lighting perfectly. David's face lit up in a way that made something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. He introduced her as his business partner, someone who'd been helping him with a special real estate project. The way he said her name, though, lingered too long in his mouth. She extended her hand to me with practiced confidence, and that's when I saw it. The delicate silver band with the tiny emerald stone, worn exactly how my grandmother used to wear it on her ring finger. My breath caught in my throat. The ring had been missing from my jewelry box for over 2 years. I'd torn our house apart looking for it, convinced I'd misplaced it during our move to Maple Grove Lane. Amanda noticed my stare and smiled sweetly, mentioning how David had told her so much about me. Her voice sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation. David kept glancing between us, his nervous energy filling the space around our table. Something felt orchestrated about this entire encounter. The dinner continued with forced pleasantries while my mind raced. How did this woman have my grandmother's ring? Why was David so comfortable with her wearing it? Amanda spoke about their business ventures with intimate knowledge of David's schedule, his preferences, even his coffee order. She knew details about him that felt too personal for a professional relationship. When Amanda excused herself to the restroom, I grabbed David's arm. "The ring," I whispered urgently. "She's wearing my grandmother's ring." David looked genuinely confused, telling me I must be mistaken. Lots of people had similar vintage jewelry. But I knew that ring intimately. The tiny scratch on the band where my grandmother had accidentally hit it against a doorframe, the way the emerald caught light at specific angles, this wasn't similar jewelry, this was mine. David's explanation felt hollow, dismissive in a way that made me question my own eyes. He suggested maybe the anniversary stress was making me imagine things. The condescending tone in his voice was new, or maybe I'd never noticed it before. Amanda returned to the table glowing, mentioning how she needed to get home to feed her cats. David offered to walk her to her car, leaving me sitting alone with the check and a growing sense of unease. Outside the restaurant, I watched through the window as David hugged Amanda goodbye. The embrace lasted too long, his hand lingering on her lower back in a gesture I recognized as intimate. They spoke quietly, heads close together, before she drove away in a red BMW I'd never seen before. When David returned, he seemed different, distant, distracted. The drive home filled with uncomfortable silence. I kept thinking about the ring, about Amanda's familiarity with David's life, about the way they'd looked together outside the restaurant. Every rational explanation I tried to construct fell apart under the weight of what I'd witnessed. David turned up the radio to fill the quiet space between us. That night, sleep escaped me completely. I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to his steady breathing, while my mind churned through every interaction from the evening. The ring haunted me. I'd inherited it from my grandmother when she passed 5 years ago. It had been one of my most treasured possessions, something I'd planned to pass down to my own daughter someday. Around 3 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and went to my jewelry box one more time. I searched through every compartment, every small velvet pouch, hoping maybe I'd somehow missed it all these years. But the ring remained absent, just as it had been for the past 2 years. The empty space where it should have been felt like an accusation. I found myself standing in our kitchen, staring out the back window at our quiet neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows across our backyard, making familiar shapes look foreign and threatening. Something fundamental had shifted during that dinner. The foundation of trust I'd built my marriage on felt suddenly unstable. The next morning, David left early for work without his usual goodbye kiss. He mentioned having several property showings scheduled, including one with Amanda. The casual way he dropped her name into conversation made my skin crawl. I asked if I could meet her again sometime, maybe get to know his business partner better. David's response came too quickly, too rehearsed. She was very busy, traveled frequently for work, probably wouldn't have time for social visits. After David left, I sat at our kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, trying to make sense of everything. 3 years of marriage, 5 years total, and I'd never heard Amanda's name until last night. Yet she seemed to know intimate details about our life together. She'd mentioned the color we painted our bedroom, a detail David must have shared with her at some point. I decided to do something I never done before in our relationship. I searched David's name online along with Amanda's, looking for any business connections or professional listings. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through the results. There were photos of them together at various real estate events, dating back over a year. In several pictures, they stood close together, comfortable in each other's space, in ways that suggested more than professional courtesy. One photo from a real estate conference 6 months ago showed Amanda wearing a different ring, a gold band with small diamonds that looked familiar. I rushed upstairs to my jewelry box and confirmed my suspicion. Another missing piece, a ring my mother had given me for my college graduation. I'd assumed I'd lost it during a vacation last summer, but seeing it on Amanda's finger in that photo made everything click into place. David wasn't just having an affair.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Giving Amanda my jewelry, pieces that held deep sentimental value, family heirlooms I'd treasured for years. The violation felt deeper than infidelity. It was theft of my history, my connection to the women in my family who'd worn those rings before me. I spent the morning going through old photos on my phone, looking for any other jewelry I might have forgotten about. The search revealed a pattern I'd been too trusting to see before. Over the past 2 years, several pieces had gone missing. A pearl necklace from my aunt, a silver bracelet from my sweet 16 birthday, a pair of vintage earrings I'd inherited from my great-grandmother. Each disappearance had a reasonable explanation at the time. I'd been careless, distracted by work stress or moving boxes. David had been sympathetic, helping me search for the missing pieces, comforting me when they never turned up. Now I realized he'd been orchestrating my confusion, gaslighting me into believing I was simply irresponsible with my belongings. The morning stretched on with me researching Amanda Torres online. Her boutique, The Vintage Rose, specialized in estate jewelry and vintage accessories. Her website featured a collection of rings, necklaces, and bracelets that looked suspiciously similar to pieces I'd lost over the years. The descriptions mentioned unique vintage finds and estate sale discoveries, but I recognized the intimate details of my own jewelry in several listings. My phone rang around noon, David calling to check in. His voice sounded strained, asking if I was feeling all right after last night. I had seemed quiet during dinner, he said, and he wanted to make sure I wasn't coming down with something. The false concern in his tone made me nauseous. I told him I was fine, just thinking about work projects. He seemed satisfied with that explanation and mentioned he'd be late getting home due to evening appointments. After hanging up, I realized I needed help processing what I'd discovered. Jessica had been my closest friend since college, someone I could trust with anything. I called her at her graphic design studio, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. Jess listened without interrupting, letting me pour out every detail from the previous night and my morning discoveries. When I finished talking, Jess was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made my world tilt sideways. "Sarah, I've been worried about you for months. You've seemed different lately, more anxious, constantly losing things. I thought maybe you were having some kind of breakdown from grief after your mom passed. But what you're describing sounds deliberate." She offered to come over immediately, bringing her laptop so we could investigate together. I agreed, needing someone else to confirm what I was seeing wasn't just paranoid imagination. While waiting for Jess to arrive, I decided to do something I'd never considered before. I searched our house systematically, looking for evidence of David's deception. The search started in obvious places: his dresser drawers, his side of the closet, his bathroom cabinet. Nothing seemed out of place until I reached his home office. The door was locked, which struck me as odd since he'd never locked it before. I remember him installing the new locks several months ago, claiming he needed privacy for client calls and sensitive real estate documents. I found the spare key taped under his desk drawer, a hiding spot he'd used for years. Inside the office, everything appeared normal at first glance. His computer was password protected, his filing cabinets locked. But tucked behind a stack of real estate magazines, I found something that made my heart stomp. A small, velvet jewelry box, the kind used for engagement rings. Inside the box was a ring I'd never seen before, clearly expensive, with a large diamond surrounded by smaller stones. A note tucked beneath it read, "For A, when the time is right, D." The handwriting was definitely David's, recognizable from years of grocery lists and birthday cards. The date on the note was from 3 weeks ago. My hands trembled as I photographed the ring and note with my phone. David was planning to propose to Amanda while married to me. The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined possible. This wasn't just an affair or stolen jewelry. This was a complete double life with me as the unwitting obstacle to his real relationship. Jessica arrived as I was sitting in the office, staring at the engagement ring box. She took one look at my face and knew something devastating had happened. I showed her everything: the ring, the note, the photos from my phone of Amanda wearing my grandmother's jewelry. Jess sat down heavily in David's office chair, processing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. She pulled out her laptop and started her own investigation, using her graphic design connections to access reverse image searches and social media analysis tools. Within minutes, she'd found Amanda's personal Instagram account, set to private but with enough public posts to reveal the truth. Amanda had been posting photos of herself wearing my jewelry for months, tagging locations where she and David had been together. The posts painted a picture of a relationship that had been developing parallel to my marriage. Date nights at restaurants I'd never been to, weekend trips to places David claimed to visit for work, intimate photos of Amanda wearing jewelry I'd thought was lost forever. Each post felt like a knife twisting deeper into wounds I didn't know existed. Jessica discovered something else that made both of us go silent. Amanda's boutique wasn't just selling vintage jewelry, it was selling my jewelry. Several pieces I recognized were listed in her online store with fabricated provenance stories. My mother's pearl necklace was described as a stunning vintage piece from a 1960s estate sale. My great-grandmother's earrings were listed as authentic Art Deco finds from a private collector. The realization hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't just been giving Amanda my jewelry as romantic gifts. They'd been stealing from me and selling my family heirlooms for profit. The boutique was essentially a fence for my stolen property, with Amanda playing the role of legitimate vintage dealer while David supplied inventory from our home. We spent the afternoon documenting everything we could find: photos, screenshots, price listings, social media posts, anything that could serve as evidence. Jessica helped me create a timeline of when each piece had gone missing and when it had appeared either on Amanda or in her store. The pattern was unmistakable and deliberate. As the sun began setting, Jessica looked at me seriously and said we needed to involve the police. This went beyond infidelity, into criminal territory. Theft, fraud, possibly identity theft if they'd been using my information for business purposes. But first, she suggested we needed to know how extensive the operation was. And that's when I remembered the basement storage room.
David had claimed it for his real estate files when we moved in, installing heavy-duty filing cabinets and keeping the room locked. He'd told me it was boring paperwork storage, nothing I'd be interested in seeing. Now I wondered what else he'd been hiding down there. The basement felt colder than usual as we descended the stairs. The storage room lock was newer and more sophisticated than the simple office lock upstairs. Jessica proved surprisingly skilled at lockpicking, a talent left over from a rebellious teenage phase she'd never mentioned before. The door clicked open after several tense minutes. Inside the storage room, we found David's real business. Filing cabinets contained detailed records of dozens of women, complete with photos, personal information, and inventories of valuable items in their homes. My file was the thickest, documenting 3 years of systematic theft with meticulous precision. Each woman's file contained similar information: work schedules, daily routines, security systems, valuable possessions, and emotional vulnerabilities. David had been targeting women going through difficult life transitions, divorces, deaths in the family, job losses, health crises, times when they might be more likely to misplace valuable items or trust a charming, supportive man who seemed to care about their well-being. The scope of his operation was staggering. Dozens of women across Colorado and neighboring states, each one systematically robbed of family heirlooms and valuable jewelry. Amanda's boutique was just one outlet. We found records of online sales, auction houses, and private collectors who'd boxed stolen goods without knowing their true origin. My file contained photos of me sleeping, copies of my work schedule, detailed floor plans of our house, and a complete inventory of every piece of valuable jewelry I owned. Some items were marked as acquired with dates and methods. Others were marked pending with planned acquisition strategies. David had been studying me like a predator studies prey. The most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Final Phase that contained legal documents. David had been researching how to have me declared mentally incompetent, with plans to gain control of my inheritance from my mother's estate. Medical records showed he'd been secretly adding substances to my food and drinks, causing the anxiety and memory issues I'd attributed to grief. Jessica found a hidden safe behind the filing cabinets containing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and a collection of the most valuable stolen jewelry. My grandmother's engagement ring sat in a place of honor, along with pieces from dozens of other women. Each item was tagged with the victim's name and estimated value. We photographed everything, creating a comprehensive record of David's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, implicating both David and Amanda in a sophisticated theft ring that had been operating for years. I wasn't just a wife who'd been cheated on. I was a victim of elaborate psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. As we prepared to leave the basement, I heard the garage door opening upstairs. David was home early, calling my name as he entered the house. Jessica and I looked at each other in panic. We were trapped in the basement with evidence of crimes that could put both perpetrators in prison for decades. If David found us there, we might not live to testify against him. Part 2, the escape plan. Jessica grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin as we heard David's footsteps moving across the kitchen floor above us. The basement suddenly felt like a tomb with only one exit leading directly into his path. We stood frozen among the filing cabinets full of evidence, listening to him call my name again, his voice carrying that false warmth I now recognized as calculated manipulation. The basement had a small window near the ceiling, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Jessica pointed to it silently, her eyes wide with fear but determined. We'd have to move the filing cabinet to reach it, and any noise might alert David to our presence. Above us, his footsteps moved toward the basement door. I could hear him opening and closing doors throughout the house, searching for me with increasing urgency. His voice took on an edge I'd rarely heard before, calling my name with forced casualness that didn't quite hide his growing concern. Jessica was already moving, quietly sliding files and documents into her large messenger bag, while I tried to process our options. The filing cabinet proved heavier than expected, requiring both of us to lift it silently away from the wall. Every small scrape against the concrete floor sounded thunderous in the enclosed space. David's search seemed to be moving systematically through the house, checking each room thoroughly. We had minutes at most before he thought to check the basement. Jessica went first, boosting herself up to the narrow window and working to unlatch the old mechanism. Years of moisture had rusted the hinges, making them resistant to quiet manipulation. I stood below her, steadying her legs while listening for any change in David's movement pattern upstairs. The window finally gave way with a soft grinding sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. She squeezed through the opening with surprising agility, dropping onto the soft earth outside our foundation. I handed up her bag of evidence, then hoisted myself toward the window. The opening was tighter than it had appeared, requiring me to exhale completely and angle my shoulders to fit through. Glass fragments from the old window frame scraped against my arms as I pulled myself up. David's voice suddenly changed location, moving toward the basement stairs. I could hear his hand on the doorknob as I finally pulled my legs through the window, tumbling ungracefully onto the ground beside Jessica. We both lay still for a moment, pressed against the foundation wall, listening to his footsteps descending into the basement below us. The sound of the storage room door being tried echoed through the basement walls. David's voice changed tone completely, becoming sharp and angry when he discovered the lock had been tampered with. He was no longer calling my name sweetly. Instead, he was moving through the storage room with heavy, deliberate steps, clearly assessing what had been disturbed. Jessica motioned for us to move away from the house immediately. We crawled along the foundation until we reached her car parked several houses down the street. The familiar neighborhood looked different now, shadows seeming deeper and more threatening. Every lit window felt like an eye watching our escape, every parked car a potential hiding spot for David if he decided to search outside. Once inside her car, Jessica started the engine quietly and drove slowly away from Maple Grove Lane. Neither of us spoke until we'd put several miles between ourselves and the house. The silence was heavy with the adrenaline of the escape and the realization of the danger we had narrowly averted.
Felt heavy with the weight of what we'd discovered, each of us processing the magnitude of David's deception and the immediate danger we'd narrowly escaped. Jessica finally broke the silence as we stopped at a red light. "We need to go to the police immediately," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "What we found down there isn't just about you anymore. There are dozens of other women who deserve justice, and David knows we've seen everything. He's going to try to destroy evidence or disappear entirely." I nodded, though part of me felt paralyzed by the scope of what lay ahead. Reporting David meant acknowledging that my entire marriage had been a lie, that I'd been living with a criminal who'd been systematically destroying my mental health while stealing my most precious possessions. The man I'd trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities had been documenting those vulnerabilities as weaknesses to exploit. We drove to the Riverside Heights police station, a building I'd passed countless times during my normal life, but never imagined entering under such circumstances. The night desk sergeant listened to our initial explanation with professional skepticism that gradually shifted to alarm as Jessica displayed the photographs we'd taken in the basement storage room. Detective Maria Santos was called in despite the late hour, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. She listened to our entire story without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never questioning the believability of what we were reporting. Her reaction suggested she'd encountered similar cases before. The evidence we'd photographed was compelling enough to warrant immediate action.
Detective Santos explained that what we'd uncovered appeared to be an organized theft ring operating across multiple jurisdictions, potentially involving interstate commerce violations and fraud charges that could bring federal attention. The scope of David's operation elevated it far beyond simple marital infidelity. While Detective Santos organized a team to secure evidence from our house, she arranged for Jessica and me to stay in a safe location for the night. The hotel room felt surreal, sterile and anonymous compared to the home I'd shared with David for 3 years. I sat on the bed staring at my phone, which had been buzzing constantly with increasingly frantic calls and texts from my husband. His messages started concerned and loving, asking where I was and whether I was safe. As the hours passed without response, they became more demanding and possessive. By midnight, they'd taken on a threatening undertone that revealed glimpses of the man I'd discovered in those basement files. The David I'd married was entirely fictional, a carefully constructed persona designed to gain my trust and access to my valuables. Jessica researched Amanda Torres throughout the night, using her professional network and social media investigation skills to build a complete picture of David's partner in crime. Amanda's background revealed a pattern of relationships with wealthy or financially stable men, each ending when those men reported mysterious thefts of valuable items. She'd moved frequently, changing locations every few years, and always managing to avoid serious legal consequences. The boutique operation was more sophisticated than we'd initially realized. Amanda had established relationships with legitimate auction houses and estate sale companies, providing seemingly authentic provenance documentation for stolen goods. Her reputation in the vintage jewelry community was solid, built on years of careful cultivation and strategic networking. Detective Santos returned in the early morning hours with updates from the search of our house. David had attempted to remove evidence from the basement storage room, but the investigation team had secured most of the files and documentation before he could destroy them. He'd been arrested while trying to load filing cabinets into his car, claiming he was simply organizing business documents. The safe behind the filing cabinets had contained even more evidence than we'd photographed, including detailed financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in sales of stolen jewelry over the past 5 years. Amanda had been arrested simultaneously at her boutique, where police found additional stolen goods and documentation linking her directly to David's operation. Both suspects were being held without bail due to flight risk concerns and the severity of the charges. The investigation was expanding to include FBI involvement, as evidence suggested the theft ring had operated across multiple states and potentially involved wire fraud and money laundering charges. What had started as my personal discovery of marital infidelity had uncovered a major criminal enterprise. Detective Santos arranged for me to meet with other victims whose cases were connected to David's operation. Hearing their stories helped me understand that I wasn't alone in being targeted and manipulated. Each woman described similar patterns of psychological manipulation, gaslighting about missing items, and gradual erosion of their confidence and mental stability. One victim, Patricia Williams, had been married to David's associate in Denver for 2 years before discovering that her husband had been systematically drugging her to cause memory problems while stealing her deceased mother's jewelry collection. Another, Alina Rodriguez, had dated David himself briefly 3 years before he met me, losing family heirlooms worth over $50,000 during their 6-month relationship. The stories revealed that David and his network had been targeting vulnerable women for years, using romantic relationships as cover for elaborate theft operations. They specifically sought out women going through emotional difficulties, recent losses, or major life transitions that made them more susceptible to manipulation and less likely to notice missing items immediately.
Complex than anyone had initially suspected, David functioned as a regional coordinator, recruiting and managing local operatives who identified and groomed potential victims. These operatives, both male and female, would establish romantic or friendship relationships with targets, gaining access to their homes and personal information over months or years. Agent Chen showed me surveillance photos of David meeting with other network members at locations throughout Colorado. Men and women I didn't recognize, all involved in similar operations targeting different demographic groups and geographic areas. Some specialized in elderly victims, others in divorced women, others in recent widows or people dealing with serious illnesses. The psychological profiling was particularly disturbing. The network had developed detailed criteria for selecting victims based on emotional vulnerability, social isolation, and financial assets. They maintained databases of potential targets, tracking personal information gathered from social media, public records, and direct observation. My own file had been started 2 years before David and I even met. The meeting location where David had first approached me, at a coffee shop near my workplace, hadn't been coincidental. He'd been surveilling me for weeks, learning my routine and identifying the optimal moment to initiate contact. Our entire courtship had been choreographed, from his choice of conversation topics to the timing of relationship milestones, all designed to maximize my emotional investment while gaining access to my valuables. Agent Chen explained that the network's success depended on victims not realizing they'd been targeted until long after the relationships ended. Most victims attributed missing items to their own carelessness or memory problems, especially when their partners provided convincing alternative explanations and emotional support during the search process. The gaslighting was systematic and psychologically sophisticated. The evidence recovered from David's files included detailed psychological assessments of each victim, noting their emotional triggers, security habits, and potential resistance to manipulation. My file contained observations about my grief following my mother's death, my tendency to trust people quickly, and my habit of removing jewelry before exercising or doing household chores. Every personal detail had been weaponized against me. Financial records showed that the network had generated millions of dollars over the past decade, with stolen goods sold through multiple channels, including online auction sites, international buyers, and legitimate businesses that unknowingly purchased stolen merchandise. The money was laundered through a complex system of shell companies and overseas accounts. Amanda's boutique was just one of many front businesses operated by the network. Similar operations included antique stores, estate sale companies, jewelry repair shops, and even funeral homes that had access to valuable items during vulnerable family situations. The legitimate businesses provided cover for the stolen goods while generating additional revenue through normal commercial activities. The investigation revealed that David had been planning to escalate his operation against me significantly. Documents found in his files outlined plans to have me declared mentally incompetent due to increasing memory problems and anxiety, which he'd been deliberately causing through subtle poisoning with substances that mimicked early dementia symptoms. Once he gained control of my affairs, he'd planned to liquidate my assets and disappear. The medical evidence was particularly chilling. Blood tests ordered by the FBI confirmed the presence of several substances in my system that could cause the symptoms I'd been experiencing. David had been adding small amounts of various compounds to my food and drinks over months, creating a pattern of cognitive decline that would have supported his claims about my mental capacity. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a toxicologist working with the FBI, explained that the substances David had been using were sophisticated and difficult to detect without specific testing. They were designed to create symptoms that could be attributed to stress, grief, or natural aging, rather than deliberate poisoning. The dosages were carefully calculated to impair my judgment and memory without causing obvious physical illness. The realization that David had been slowly poisoning me while pretending to care for my health felt like a violation beyond anything I'd experienced. He'd held me while I cried about forgetting important things, comforted me when I worried about developing early-onset dementia like my grandmother, and encouraged me to see a doctor about my increasing anxiety, all while he was the cause of my suffering. Agent Chen arranged for me to meet with Dr. Lisa Park, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery for victims of long-term psychological manipulation. Dr. Park explained that what I'd experienced was a form of extended psychological torture designed to break down my sense of reality and self-trust. The recovery process would take time and professional support. The network's recruitment methods were revealed through interrogation of other arrested members. They specifically targeted people in helping professions like real estate, healthcare, and counseling, where building trust with vulnerable individuals was a normal part of the job. David's success as a real estate agent had provided perfect cover for his criminal activities while giving him access to information about potential victims. Other network members included a nurse who targeted elderly patients, a grief counselor who exploited widows and widowers, and a veterinarian who gained access to homes through pet care services.
Each operative used their professional credibility to gain trust and access while gathering intelligence about valuable possessions and security vulnerabilities. The investigation team discovered that the network maintained detailed training materials for new operatives, including scripts for common situations, psychological manipulation techniques, and methods for avoiding detection. The materials read like a manual for professional con artists, with complete case studies and best practices developed over years of successful operations. Evidence suggested that Amanda had been grooming David for years before their partnership began, slowly introducing him to more sophisticated criminal techniques while he developed his skills with smaller-scale thefts. Their relationship combined genuine criminal partnership with personal involvement, making their operation particularly effective and difficult to detect. The financial analysis revealed that David had been supporting a lavish lifestyle through his criminal earnings while maintaining the appearance of a successful but modest real estate career. Hidden accounts contained hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen cash, and the business records showed that the network had been monitoring my finances for potential opportunities for theft or extortion.
Of thousands of dollars. Expensive purchases made through shell companies and investments in legitimate businesses that helped launder stolen money. Part 4. The web of lies deepens. The federal investigation uncovered connections that reached far beyond what anyone had initially suspected, revealing that David's network was part of an even larger criminal organization operating internationally. Agent Chen called me back to the federal building a week after the initial arrests, her expression grim as she shared new developments that would fundamentally change my understanding of the case. Forensic analysis of David's computers and phones had revealed communications with criminal contacts in Europe and Asia, suggesting that some of the highest value stolen jewelry was being sold to international collectors who specialized in acquiring pieces with questionable provenance. My grandmother's engagement ring, along with other family heirlooms, had likely been photographed and offered to overseas buyers before I'd even noticed they were missing. The international connections explained how the network had operated for so long without detection. Stolen goods were moved quickly out of the country, making recovery difficult and reducing the likelihood that victims would encounter their missing items in local markets. The sophisticated export operation required connections with shipping companies, customs brokers, and international buyers that suggested years of careful relationship building. Agent Chen showed me intercepted communications that revealed David had been planning to relocate our entire operation overseas within the next 6 months. The timeline explained his recent pushes for us to travel more, his suggestions about spending extended time in Europe, and his newfound interest in international real estate opportunities. He'd been laying groundwork for our disappearance from the United States. The poison testing results were even more disturbing than initially suspected. Dr. Hoffman explained that David had been using a combination of substances that not only caused memory problems and anxiety, but also would have led to serious organ damage if continued long-term. The medical evidence suggested he'd been planning my death rather than just incapacitation, timing it to coincide with his planned departure from the country. Financial forensics revealed that David had taken out multiple life insurance policies on me over the past year, totaling nearly $2 million. The policies were purchased through different companies and agents, avoiding detection while maximizing potential payout. Combined with his plans to gain control of my inheritance, my death would have provided him with substantial financial resources for his new life overseas. The insurance investigation uncovered other suspicious deaths connected to the network's operations. 3 women in different states who had been involved with network operatives had died under circumstances initially attributed to accidents or natural causes, but which showed patterns consistent with the substances found in my system. Their deaths had all resulted in significant insurance payouts to their partners. Detective Santos worked with federal agents to coordinate exhumation orders for the 3 deceased women, seeking evidence of foul play that might have been missed during initial investigations. The legal process was complex, requiring cooperation from multiple jurisdictions and consent from family members who were just learning about their loved ones' potential murders. The scope of the investigation expanded to include potential homicide charges against network leaders, elevating the case to one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. Additional federal agencies became involved, including specialists in international crime, financial investigations, and victim services. The case was generating significant media attention as more details became public. My role as a key witness meant increased security measures and ongoing protection from potential retaliation. Agent Chan explained that other network members remained at large, including senior leaders who had the resources and motivation to eliminate witnesses who could testify against the organization. The safe house accommodations were extended indefinitely while the investigation continued. The psychological evaluation process revealed the extent of the manipulation I'd endured. Dr. Park used specialized assessment tools to document the systematic destruction of my self-confidence and decision-making abilities that David had orchestrated over our relationship. The psychological damage was significant enough to support additional criminal charges related to intentional infliction of emotional distress. During therapy sessions, I began recovering memories that had been suppressed or confused by the substances David had been giving me. Clear recollections emerged of conversations and events that hadn't made sense at the time, but which now revealed the calculated nature of his manipulation. The recovered memories provided additional evidence for the prosecution, while helping me understand the extent of my victimization. One particularly disturbing recovered memory involved David photographing me while I was unconscious from the substances he had given me, images that were likely shared with network contacts for purposes I preferred not to contemplate. The violation of privacy and dignity felt almost as traumatic as the physical poisoning, representing a level of betrayal that challenged my ability to trust anyone completely. The network's recruitment and training materials revealed that David had been considered a rising star within the organization, praised for his ability to maintain long-term relationships with targets while maximizing both financial and intelligence-gathering outcomes. His success with my case had earned him promotion to a regional leadership role with plans to establish operations in European markets, using his experience with American victims. Communication intercepts showed that network leaders had been monitoring the investigation since David's arrest, discussing strategies to eliminate evidence and witnesses while relocating key operations to safer jurisdictions. The ongoing threat required constant vigilance from law enforcement and significant lifestyle changes for victims and witnesses cooperating with the prosecution. Agent Chen arranged for me to participate in a victim impact program designed to help prosecutors understand the full scope of harm caused by the network's operations. Meeting with other victims helped me process my own experience while contributing to a comprehensive case against the organization. The shared experiences created unexpected bonds with women who understood the unique trauma of long-term intimate betrayal. The financial recovery process began with efforts to trace and freeze assets connected to the network's operations. Recovering
Stolen goods required cooperation from international law enforcement agencies and private organizations that had unknowingly purchased stolen merchandise. The complex legal procedures meant that recovering my grandmother's ring and other family heirlooms would take months or years, if recovery was possible at all. Evidence emerged that Amanda had been planning to assume my identity completely, using documents stolen from our home to establish herself as Sarah Mitchell in another state. The identity theft operation was sophisticated enough to have succeeded if the network hadn't been exposed, potentially leaving me without a legal identity while Amanda used my credentials to target new victims.
The investigation revealed that David had been documenting not just my valuables and vulnerabilities, but also those of my friends and family members. Jessica's information was included in his files, along with plans to target her through a separate operative if my case had continued successfully. The network's expansion plans had included most of the people I cared about, making the investigation personally relevant to everyone in my life. Part 5. The confrontation approaches. The federal prosecution team began preparing for trial while continuing to uncover new evidence that expanded the scope of charges against David and his network. Lead prosecutor James Morrison explained that the case had become one of the most comprehensive organized crime prosecutions in the district's history, with charges ranging from theft and fraud to attempted murder and international conspiracy. David's defense strategy became clear through pre-trial motions and media statements from his attorney. He claimed to be a victim of Amanda's manipulation, suggesting that she had deceived him about the source of the jewelry and gradually drawn him into criminal activities without his full understanding. The defense portrayed him as another victim rather than a willing participant in the network's operations. Amanda's defense took a different approach, claiming that she was actually an undercover investigator working to expose the network from within. Her attorneys produced forged documents, suggesting she had been cooperating with law enforcement agencies, though federal agents quickly debunked these claims. The competing defense strategies created friction between the co-defendants that prosecutors hoped to exploit. Agent Chen arranged for me to observe David's interrogation through one-way glass, giving me the opportunity to see him without the artificial persona he'd maintained throughout our relationship. Watching him interact with investigators was like seeing a completely different person, someone cold and calculating who bore no resemblance to the loving husband I'd thought I'd married. During the interrogation, David showed no remorse for the harm he'd caused, instead focusing on legal strategies and attempts to minimize his potential sentence. He discussed me and the other victims in clinical terms, as if we were business assets rather than human beings whose lives he'd systematically destroyed. The casual way he described poisoning me and planning my death was more chilling than any emotion would have been. When confronted with evidence of the poisoning, David claimed it had been intended to help me relax and deal with stress rather than cause harm. He maintained this position even when presented with medical evidence showing the substances would have caused organ failure if continued. His ability to rationalize attempted murder as kindness revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. The prosecution team used David's lack of empathy and continued manipulation attempts during interrogation as evidence of his dangerousness and inability to be rehabilitated. His conversations with attorneys were recorded when he waived privilege, revealing ongoing plans to contact remaining network members and coordinate alibis for various criminal charges. Amanda proved more cooperative during questioning, providing information about network operations in exchange for potential sentence reductions. Her revelations led to arrests of additional network members across multiple states and provided crucial intelligence about international connections. However, her cooperation was clearly motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse. The victim impact preparations required me to document not just the financial losses and physical harm I'd suffered, but also the psychological trauma and ongoing effects of David's manipulation. Dr. Park helped me articulate the ways that the betrayal had affected my ability to trust others, make decisions, and maintain normal relationships. Preparing my victim impact statement meant confronting the full scope of what David had stolen from me, beyond just the jewelry and money. He'd stolen years of my life, my sense of safety and security, my ability to trust my own perceptions, and my faith in the possibility of genuine love and commitment. The intangible losses were harder to quantify, but more devastating than the material theft. The prosecution team prepared me for David's likely reaction to my testimony, warning that he might attempt to manipulate me even during court proceedings. They explained that skilled manipulators often use court appearances as opportunities to reestablish psychological control over their victims through eye contact, body language, and subtle communications. Evidence emerged that David had been planning to target my sister Rebecca next, using his position as my brother-in-law to gain access to her home and valuables. Rebecca had recently inherited valuable jewelry from our grandmother, making her an attractive target for the network's operations. The discovery that my entire family had been at risk added another layer of violation to David's betrayal. The international investigation revealed that several pieces of my jewelry had already been sold to collectors in Europe and Asia, making recovery unlikely even if the prosecution succeeded. The knowledge that my grandmother's engagement ring was probably sitting in a stranger's collection halfway around the world
felt like losing her all over again. Financial experts calculated that David had stolen approximately $300,000 worth of jewelry and cash from me over our relationship, not including the value of insurance policies and inheritance access he'd been planning to claim. The financial impact was significant, but the psychological damage was incalculable and would require years of therapy to address fully. The trial date was set for 6 months after David's arrest, giving the prosecution team time to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies and prepare the complex financial evidence required to prove the full scope of the conspiracy. The delay meant continued security precautions and lifestyle
Limitations, but also time for psychological healing and preparation. Jessica remained my primary support system throughout the pretrial period, attending therapy sessions when possible and helping me navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of being a federal witness. Her friendship became even more precious knowing that David had planned to target her as well, making her both a fellow victim and a crucial ally. The media attention surrounding the case brought unexpected support from other victims of similar crimes, women who reached out to share their experiences and offer encouragement. The shared experiences helped me understand that what I had endured wasn't unique or personal, but part of a systematic pattern of exploitation that targeted vulnerable people across the country. Dr. Park helped me understand that healing from intimate betrayal trauma required rebuilding fundamental beliefs about safety, trust, and self-worth that David's manipulation had systematically destroyed. The recovery process would continue long after the legal proceedings ended, requiring ongoing commitment to therapy and self-care. The approach of the trial brought both anticipation for justice and anxiety about confronting David again in a public setting. The courtroom would be the first time I'd seen him since discovering the truth about our relationship, and I was uncertain how I would react to being in the same room with someone who had planned my death while professing to love me. Agent Chen assured me that extensive security measures would be in place during the trial, including plainclothes officers throughout the courtroom and secure transportation to and from the courthouse. The precautions were necessary because other network members remained at large and had both the motivation and resources to interfere with witness testimony. The countdown to trial became a period of final preparation, gathering strength for the confrontation that would determine not just David's fate, but also my ability to reclaim my life from the shadow of his manipulation. The approaching trial represented both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of David's control over my life and the start of whatever came next. Part 6. The trial begins. The courthouse steps felt like walking into a lion's den as media crews positioned their cameras and reporters shouted questions I couldn't bring myself to answer. Agent Chen guided me through the crowd with professional efficiency, her hand steady on my elbow as photographers captured what would become the public face of one of Colorado's most shocking criminal cases. The reality of my private nightmare becoming public spectacle hit me with unexpected force. Inside the federal courthouse, the marble corridors echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations as lawyers, investigators, and court personnel prepared for what prosecutor James Morrison had described as a landmark case in organized crime prosecution. The building's imposing architecture seemed designed to remind everyone present of the weight of justice, though I wondered if justice could ever truly balance the scales of what David had stolen from me. The courtroom itself was larger than I'd expected, with rows of wooden benches that would soon fill with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of other victims. The jury box sat empty, waiting for 12 strangers who would decide David's fate based on evidence that represented the most traumatic period of my life. I tried to imagine explaining to them how someone could live so completely false a life for so many years. Prosecutor Morrison met with me one final time before proceedings began, reviewing my testimony and preparing me for the defense's likely strategy. He explained that David's attorney would probably try to portray me as an unreliable witness whose memory had been compromised by the substances David had given me, turning his own crime into a defense against my credibility. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The
The prosecution's opening strategy focused on the systematic nature of the crimes rather than the individual victims, painting a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated for years with military-like precision. Morrison wanted the jury to understand that this wasn't a case of passion or a momentary weakness, but calculated exploitation of vulnerable people by predators who had turned manipulation into a profitable business. When David entered the courtroom, flanked by his defense team, I felt my breath catch in my throat despite months of psychological preparation for this moment. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than the man who had dominated my life through fear and manipulation. The expensive suit and confident posture couldn't hide the fact that he was just another criminal sitting in a defendant's chair, stripped of the power he'd wielded through deception. His eyes found mine across the courtroom with the same calculated intensity I now recognized as his signature weapon. Even handcuffed and facing life in prison, David attempted to establish the psychological connection that had once made me doubt my own perceptions. But months of therapy and the support of Agent Chen and Dr. Park had built walls around my mind that his stare couldn't penetrate. Amanda sat at a separate defense table, her legal team having successfully argued for separate trials based on conflicting defense strategies. She appeared nervous and diminished compared to the confident boutique owner I'd met at our anniversary dinner, her designer clothes replaced with standard prison attire that made her look more like what she really was, a career criminal facing the consequences of years of theft and fraud. The jury selection process took 3 days, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for any connections to law enforcement, real estate, or domestic violence that might influence their perspective on the case. Morrison wanted jurors who could understand complex financial evidence while remaining emotionally engaged with the human impact of the crimes. The defense sought people who might be skeptical of victim testimony or sympathetic to claims of manipulation. Judge Patricia Williams brought decades of experience in complex criminal cases to the proceedings, establishing ground rules that would protect witnesses while ensuring fair representation for the defendants. Her reputation for running efficient courtrooms while maintaining strict standards of evidence gave me confidence that the truth would have a fair hearing regardless of the defense's manipulation tactics. The prosecution's case began with Agent Chen presenting the scope of the investigation, using visual aids and timeline graphics to help the jury understand the complexity of the criminal network David had operated. Charts showing the flow of stolen goods from victims to buyers painted a clear picture of system
Theft disguised as romantic relationships and business partnerships. Financial expert Dr. Michael Torres testified about the money laundering operation that had moved millions of dollars through shell companies and international accounts. His analysis revealed that David and his network had generated more revenue than many legitimate businesses, treating theft as a full-time profession with sophisticated accounting and distribution systems. The medical testimony proved most compelling to the jury, with Dr. Hoffman explaining in detail how the substances David had given me would have led to my death if continued for another few months. Her presentation included charts showing the progression of organ damage and cognitive decline that would have supported David's planned claims about my mental incompetence, while ultimately resulting in my demise. The defense's cross-examination of expert witnesses focused on challenging the certainty of scientific conclusions and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. David's attorney argued that coincidence and misinterpretation had been twisted into a conspiracy theory, painting his client as a successful businessman who had been deceived by his criminal associates rather than orchestrating their activities. When my turn to testify arrived, the courtroom felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly small. Every eye in the room focused on me as I took the witness stand, knowing that my words would either contribute to David's conviction or potentially allow him to escape justice for crimes that had nearly cost me my life. The weight of representing not just my own case, but dozens of other victims made each word feel crucial. Morrison guided me through my testimony with careful questions designed to establish the timeline of our relationship and the gradual escalation of David's theft and manipulation. I described the missing jewelry, the gaslighting about my memory problems, and the discovery of evidence in our basement, trying to maintain composure while reliving the most traumatic experiences of my life.
The defense's cross-examination proved as brutal as Morrison had warned, with David's attorney suggesting that my drug-impaired memory made me an unreliable witness to my own victimization. The lawyer painted me as a grieving woman who had imagined conspiracy where none existed, turning my genuine trauma into evidence of mental instability rather than criminal victimization. David watched my testimony with the same calculating stare he'd used throughout our relationship, taking notes and whispering to his attorney in what appeared to be ongoing attempts to manipulate the proceedings. His behavior reminded me why I'd fallen for his charm initially, but also reinforced how completely false that charm had been from our very first meeting. Jessica's testimony provided crucial corroboration for my account, describing her own observations of my declining mental health during the relationship and the evidence we'd discovered together in David's basement office. Her role as an independent witness helped counter defense claims that I'd imagined or fabricated the systematic theft and manipulation. Other victims took the stand throughout the trial, each telling similar stories of charm, gradual theft, psychological manipulation, and eventual devastating betrayal. The pattern that emerged from their combined testimony painted a clear picture of David's methods and motivations, making it impossible to dismiss any individual case as coincidence or misunderstanding. Patricia Williams, the Denver victim whose husband had worked with David, provided particularly damaging testimony about the network's coordination and training methods. Her description of detailed victim files and systematic targeting strategies helped the jury understand that David's crimes weren't impulsive acts, but carefully planned operations designed to maximize profit while minimizing detection.
Jewelry by description and estimated value. Treating my family heirlooms like commodities in a global marketplace. Insurance fraud evidence revealed David's plans to profit from my death through multiple policies he'd purchased without my knowledge, using forged signatures and false information to obtain coverage totaling nearly $2 million. The insurance company's investigators testified about red flags that had been raised but not investigated thoroughly enough to prevent the policies from being issued. Medical records from my doctor visits during the poisoning period showed the progression of symptoms that David had claimed were related to stress and grief, but which actually resulted from the substances he'd been secretly giving me. The medical timeline matched perfectly with David's financial records of purchasing various compounds and equipment for preparing the toxic mixtures. Expert testimony from toxicologists explained how the specific combination of substances David had used was designed to create symptoms that would support claims of mental incompetence while gradually causing organ failure. The sophisticated knowledge required to create such mixtures suggested extensive research and planning, rather than impulsive criminal behavior. Forensic computer analysis revealed David's research into legal procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent, inheritance laws, and methods for assuming control of another person's financial assets. His browser history showed months of systematic research into every aspect of his planned crimes, from victim selection to evidence disposal. The defense's strategy of portraying David as Amanda's victim fell apart under the weight of evidence showing his leadership role in network operations and his detailed planning of crimes that went far beyond simple theft. His own communications and financial records proved he was the architect of sophisticated operations rather than a manipulated participant. Amanda's cooperation with prosecutors provided additional evidence against David, including recorded conversations where he discussed expanding operations and recruiting new network members. Her testimony revealed David's role in training other criminals and his plans to relocate the entire operation overseas to avoid law enforcement detection. Video surveillance from various locations showed David and Amanda together at times when he'd told me he was working alone, conducting what appeared to be planning meetings for their criminal activities. The surveillance also captured them celebrating successful thefts and discussing future targets, behavior inconsistent with David's claims of innocence or victimization. The prosecution's presentation of evidence of David's lavish lifestyle funded by criminal proceeds, including expensive purchases,
travel, and investments that far exceeded his legitimate income from real estate sales. Financial analysis showed that his criminal earnings had been his primary source of income for years, making theft his actual profession rather than a side activity. Psychological evaluation reports on David revealed personality traits consistent with psychopathy, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. The evaluations helped explain how he could maintain false relationships for years while systematically destroying his victims' lives without apparent remorse. Witness testimony from David's former associates in the real estate business revealed a pattern of unethical behavior and manipulation that predated his involvement in organized theft. Colleagues described instances where David had used confidential client information inappropriately and had shown unusual interest in clients' personal valuables and security arrangements. Part 8. The defense crumbles. David's defense team struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors, resorting to increasingly desperate strategies that only served to highlight the weakness of their case. Lead defense attorney Robert Martinez attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that sophisticated criminals had framed his client, but the jury's skeptical expressions suggested this strategy was backfiring. The defense's character witnesses proved ineffective when cross-examination revealed that most had no real knowledge of David's activities during the time period when his crimes were committed. Former clients and colleagues could attest to his professional competence, but had no insight into his private life or criminal associations, making their testimony irrelevant to the charges he faced. Martinez's attempt to discredit the medical evidence fell apart when his own expert witness admitted under cross-examination that the substances found in my system could only have been administered deliberately and would indeed have caused the symptoms and eventual death that prosecutors described. The expert's honesty destroyed any possibility of claiming the poisoning was accidental or misunderstood. The defense's theory that Amanda had manipulated David into criminal activity collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of David's independent criminal research and planning that had occurred before he'd even met Amanda. Financial records showed David had been stealing from previous girlfriends years before Amanda entered the picture, establishing a pattern of criminal behavior that predated their partnership. Martinez's cross-examination of victim witnesses backfired spectacularly when his aggressive questioning style came across as victim-blaming and insensitive, generating visible disapproval from jury members who had been sympathetic to the traumatic experiences described in testimony. The defense strategy of attacking victim credibility only served to reinforce the prosecution's narrative about the defendant's lack of empathy. David's decision not to testify in his own defense proved telling, especially after prosecutors had presented evidence of his articulate communications and planning documents that showed his ability to speak coherently about his criminal activities. His silence in court contrasted sharply with his documented willingness to discuss crimes in detail when he thought he wouldn't be caught. The defense's closing argument attempted to portray David as a victim of circumstances who had been drawn into criminal activity by more sophisticated criminals. But this narrative was inconsistent with evidence showing his leadership role in network operations and his meticulous planning of individual crimes. Martinez's argument felt desperate and unconvincing, even to observers sympathetic to the defense. Amanda's separate trial had concluded weeks earlier with her conviction on multiple felony charges, eliminating any possibility that she might provide testimony supporting David's claims of innocence or manipulation. Her conviction also established legal precedent for the
Prosecution's theory of the case, making it easier to convict David using similar evidence and legal arguments. The prosecution's rebuttal presentation methodically destroyed each element of the defense's case, using David's own words and actions to prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Morrison's systematic approach left no question unanswered and no defense claim unrefuted, creating a compelling narrative that connected all evidence into a coherent picture of deliberate, sophisticated criminal activity. Expert testimony about David's psychological profile contradicted defense claims that he was susceptible to manipulation by criminal associates. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a forensic psychologist, testified that David's personality assessment showed traits consistent with being a manipulator rather than someone easily manipulated by others, supporting the prosecution's portrayal of him as a criminal leader. The financial evidence proved particularly damaging to defense claims of innocence, with forensic accountants showing that David had been the primary beneficiary of the network's criminal proceeds and had made financial decisions that demonstrated knowledge of and control over illegal activities. His sophisticated money laundering techniques required expertise that contradicted claims of naive involvement. Communication evidence showed David discussing criminal activities in detail with apparent expertise and enthusiasm, language that contradicted defense claims that he was an unwilling participant in crimes orchestrated by others. His own words proved his knowledge, planning, and active participation in every aspect of the criminal enterprise. The defense's attempt to exclude evidence based on technical legal challenges had failed during pretrial motions, leaving them with no effective strategy for countering the overwhelming proof of David's guilt. Martinez's courtroom performance suggested he knew his case was hopeless, but was fulfilling his professional obligation to provide vigorous representation despite the impossibility of his task. Jury deliberations began on a Friday afternoon, with most observers predicting a quick conviction based on the strength of the prosecution's evidence and the weakness of the defense's response. The extensive evidence required time to review, but legal experts covering the trial suggested that the deliberation length would reflect thoroughness rather than any real doubt about David's guilt. Part 9. Justice served. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 3 days, carefully reviewing the extensive evidence that had been presented during 6 weeks of testimony. Their thoroughness reflected the seriousness of the charges and the complexity of the financial evidence, rather than any real doubt about David's guilt, according to courthouse observers who had covered similar trials. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly with reporters, law enforcement officials, victim family members, and curious observers who had followed the case through media coverage. I sat between Agent Chen and Jessica, trying to control my breathing as we waited for the moment that would determine whether justice would be served for David's crimes. The jury foreman, a retired engineer named Robert Chen, stood slowly as Judge Williams asked for the verdict on the first count of attempted murder. His clear voice carried across the silent courtroom as he pronounced David guilty, the word echoing off the marble walls like a bell announcing the end of years of manipulation and fear. Count after count, the verdict remained the same. Guilty of theft, guilty of fraud, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of money laundering, guilty of interstate commerce violations, guilty of poisoning with intent to cause bodily harm. Each guilty verdict felt like another weight lifted from my shoulders, validation that the nightmare I'd endured was real, and that the legal system could recognize and punish such sophisticated criminal behavior. David's face remained impassive as the verdicts were read, but his hands betrayed his emotion with subtle trembling that I recognized from moments during our relationship when his carefully constructed facade had briefly slipped. Even now, facing life in prison, he was trying to maintain the illusion of control that had defined his approach to manipulating others. The prosecution had succeeded in proving every charge beyond reasonable doubt, establishing legal precedent for future cases involving similar sophisticated criminal networks. Morrison's systematic presentation of evidence had created an unassailable case that would serve as a model for prosecuting organized theft rings that used romantic relationships as cover for criminal activity. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and pre-sentence investigation reports that would help determine appropriate punishment for crimes that had affected dozens of people across multiple states. The delay meant continued security precautions, but also provided closure to the legal uncertainty that had dominated my life for months. Agent Chen explained that David's conviction would trigger additional investigations into network associates who remained at large, potentially leading to more arrests and prosecutions that could dismantle the entire criminal organization. The evidence gathered during David's trial had provided law enforcement with intelligence about criminal operations across the western United States and internationally.
The media coverage of the verdict focused on the sophisticated nature of the criminal network and the psychological manipulation techniques that had allowed David and his associates to operate undetected for years. News reports described the case as a wake-up call about the vulnerability of people going through difficult life transitions to predators who specialize in exploiting emotional vulnerability. Victim advocacy groups praised the prosecution's comprehensive approach to documenting the full scope of harm caused by David's crimes, noting that the case had established important legal precedents for recognizing psychological manipulation and long-term exploitation as serious criminal offenses worthy of substantial punishment. The conviction brought offers of support from other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases, creating opportunities for improved cooperation and information sharing that could help prevent future crimes. The investigative techniques developed during David's case were being studied and adapted by federal agencies working on comparable criminal organizations. My victim impact statement preparation began immediately after the conviction, with Dr. Park helping me articulate the full scope of harm David had caused to my life, my relationships, and my ability to trust others. The statement would be my opportunity to ensure that the court
Understood the lasting consequences of his crimes beyond the immediate theft and physical harm. Financial recovery efforts intensified following the conviction, with federal agencies working to trace and recover stolen assets that could be returned to victims or used to compensate for losses that couldn't be recovered directly. The complex international aspects of the money laundering operation made full recovery unlikely, but any recovered funds would help victims rebuild their lives. The psychological impact of seeing justice served proved more complex than I anticipated, bringing relief but also forcing me to confront the reality that no legal verdict could undo the years of manipulation and trauma I'd endured. Dr. Park helped me understand that healing would continue long after the legal proceedings ended, requiring ongoing commitment to therapy and self-care. Jessica's support throughout the trial had deepened our friendship in ways that demonstrated the possibility of genuine trust and caring that David's manipulation had made me doubt existed. Her unwavering loyalty during the most difficult period of my life helped me believe that authentic relationships were possible, despite my traumatic experience with deception. Part 10. Moving forward. The sentencing hearing brought a different kind of resolution than the conviction had provided, offering the opportunity to speak directly about the impact David's crimes had on my life while watching him face the consequences of his systematic manipulation and theft. Judge Williams had scheduled an entire day for victim impact statements, recognizing that the scope of harm extended far beyond simple financial losses. I stood at the podium facing David for the last time, feeling the weight of representing not just my own experience, but that of dozens of other women whose lives had been devastated by his calculated cruelty. My statement focused on the psychological destruction he had caused, the theft of my sense of safety and ability to trust, and the violation of using intimate knowledge gained through false love to cause maximum harm. David listened to my words with the same calculating stare he used throughout our relationship, but the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. He was the one sitting powerless in shackles while I spoke freely about the truth of what he'd done, no longer vulnerable to his manipulation or dependent on his version of reality for my sense of self-worth. Other victims shared stories that revealed the full scope of David's criminal network and the devastating impact of long-term intimate betrayal on women who had trusted him with their hearts, homes, and most precious possessions. Each story added weight to the court's understanding of the systematic nature of his crimes and the careful planning required to cause such extensive harm. Patricia Williams described losing not just valuable jewelry, but the connection to her deceased mother that those pieces had represented, articulating the way theft of family heirlooms caused grief that extended beyond financial loss to include the severing of links to loved ones and personal history. Her words helped the court understand why these crimes deserved punishment beyond simple property theft. Elena Rodriguez spoke about the long-term psychological therapy required to rebuild her ability to trust others after discovering that her 6-month relationship with David had been entirely fabricated for the purpose of stealing jewelry inherited from her grandmother. Her ongoing struggle with paranoia and isolation demonstrated the lasting impact of David's systematic manipulation techniques. Judge Williams listened to each statement with visible attention and occasional expressions of shock at the scope of psychological damage described by victim after victim. Her experience in criminal cases had prepared her for physical violence and property crime, but the systematic psychological destruction David had caused represented a level of calculated cruelty that clearly affected even her professional composure. The prosecution's sentencing recommendation focused on the need to protect society from a sophisticated predator who had spent years perfecting techniques for identifying and exploiting vulnerable women. Morrison argued that David's crimes required maximum punishment both as justice for his victims and as a deterrent to others who might consider similar criminal enterprises. David's defense team presented mitigation evidence focused on his childhood trauma and mental health issues, arguing for a sentence that would allow possibility of rehabilitation rather than life imprisonment. The argument felt hollow given the evidence of systematic planning and David's apparent enjoyment of the manipulation and control he'd exercised over his victims. Dr. Hayes testified about David's psychological evaluation for sentencing purposes, describing personality traits that made rehabilitation unlikely and emphasizing the sophisticated nature of his manipulation techniques that had required years to develop and perfect. Her assessment supported the prosecution's argument that David represented an ongoing danger to society if ever released. Judge Williams announced David's sentence after a brief recess, imposing consecutive life terms that would ensure he never had the opportunity to manipulate and harm another victim. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the court's recognition that some criminals cannot be rehabilitated and must be permanently removed from society to protect potential future victims. The courtroom erupted in applause from victims and their families when the life sentence was announced, a rare display of emotion that Judge Williams allowed to continue for several moments before restoring order. The reaction reflected the deep relief felt by people who had lived in fear that David might someday be released to resume his predatory behavior. Amanda received a 25-year sentence at her separate hearing, with possibility of parole after 15 years in recognition of her cooperation with prosecutors and lesser role in the network's operations. Her sentence ensured that she would spend her most productive years in prison while offering eventual possibility of redemption if she demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. The asset forfeiture proceedings began immediately after sentencing, with federal agents working to liquidate David's hidden assets and recover stolen goods that could be returned to victims after David's devastating crimes. My grandmother's engagement ring was among the first items recovered, having been intercepted before shipping to an overseas buyer who specialized in acquiring stolen jewelry. Holding it again after more than 2 years felt like recovering a
of my soul that David had tried to steal along with my material possessions and peace of mind. The media attention following sentencing brought contact from other women across the country who suspected they might have been victims of similar crimes, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions that helped dismantle David's entire criminal network. The case had become a catalyst for broader law enforcement efforts to combat sophisticated theft rings that used romantic manipulation as their primary weapon. Dr. Park continued working with me on processing the complex emotions that followed achieving justice, helping me understand that healing from intimate betrayal trauma required rebuilding fundamental beliefs about safety and trust that David's manipulation had systematically destroyed. The legal victory was important, but psychological recovery would require ongoing commitment and professional support. Jessica and I began planning a trip to Europe to visit locations where some of my recovered jewelry had been traced, partly to aid in the recovery efforts, but also as a symbolic journey toward reclaiming the life that David had tried to steal. The trip represented moving forward rather than looking back, focusing on creating new memories rather than dwelling on the trauma of the past. The Victim Compensation Fund, established from David's seized assets, provided financial support for therapy and other recovery expenses, helping victims rebuild their lives without the additional burden of medical and legal costs. The fund also supported ongoing research into sophisticated manipulation techniques that could help law enforcement identify and prosecute similar crimes in the future. David's conviction had made it easier to hold other manipulative criminals accountable for the full scope of harm they caused their victims.
2 years after David's sentencing, I stood in my rebuilt life with genuine appreciation for the authentic relationships and simple pleasures that his manipulation had made me doubt were possible. The healing process had been longer and more difficult than expected, but it had ultimately led to a stronger sense of self and deeper appreciation for the genuine love and support that Jessica and other true friends had provided. The experience had taught me that surviving sophisticated manipulation and betrayal was possible, that justice could be achieved even in complex cases involving psychological abuse, and that healing was possible with professional help and genuine support from people who cared about truth rather than control. David had stolen years of my life, but he hadn't been able to destroy my capacity for growth, love, and hope for the future.
Similar crimes, potentially protecting future victims from experiencing what we'd endured. My work at a nonprofit organization that provided support services to crime victims had given me purpose beyond my own recovery, allowing me to use my experience to help other people navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of surviving sophisticated criminal manipulation. The position had initially been therapeutic for me, but had evolved into genuine career satisfaction as I developed expertise in victim advocacy and trauma-informed support services. The writing project I'd begun at Dr. Park's suggestion had expanded from personal journaling into a book manuscript that explored the psychological impact of intimate betrayal and the process of rebuilding trust and identity after systematic manipulation. The book combined my personal experience with research into manipulation techniques and recovery strategies, potentially helping other victims understand their experiences and recovery options. Speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences and victim advocacy events had become regular parts of my schedule, opportunities to share insights about David's manipulation techniques and the investigation strategies that had led to his conviction. The presentations helped other investigators recognize similar cases while providing hope to victims that justice was possible, even in complex situations involving sophisticated psychological manipulation. The romantic relationship I'd begun developing with Marcus, a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, represented a careful return to trusting another person with intimate access to my life and emotions. Our relationship had developed slowly and deliberately, with open communication about my history and ongoing healing process that created foundation for genuine intimacy rather than the false connection David had manufactured. Marcus's professional understanding of trauma and manipulation helped him recognize and respect my need for transparency and control in our relationship development. He welcomed my questions about his background, supported my continuing therapy, and demonstrated through consistent behavior over time that his interest in me was genuine rather than calculated for ulterior purposes. The legal advocacy work I'd become involved in focused on improving laws and procedures for prosecuting psychological manipulation and long-term intimate partner fraud. Crimes that had historically been difficult to prosecute due to their subtle nature and the complex evidence required to prove systematic patterns of abuse. David's case had provided important precedents, but additional legal reforms were needed to protect future victims. My relationship with my sister Rebecca had strengthened significantly as we'd worked together to understand how David's targeting had extended to our entire family network, recognizing signs of manipulation that we'd previously attributed to normal relationship dynamics. Our shared awareness of manipulation techniques had actually improved our communication and deepened our appreciation for authentic family connections. The financial recovery process had been more successful than initially expected, with international cooperation leading to the recovery of approximately 60% of the assets stolen from David's victims. My grandmother's engagement ring had become a symbol of resilience and recovery, worn now with deeper appreciation for its significance and the strength required to reclaim what criminals had tried to steal permanently. Dr. Park's research into the long-term recovery process for victims of sophisticated intimate partner fraud had been informed significantly by my case and others connected to David's network, contributing to improved therapeutic approaches and better understanding of the extended timeline required for full psychological healing from systematic manipulation and betrayal. The media attention surrounding David's case had gradually faded, allowing me to reclaim privacy while maintaining selective engagement with journalists and researchers who are working to educate the public about sophisticated manipulation techniques and the resources available to victims.
The balance between advocacy and privacy had required careful navigation, but had ultimately served both my healing and broader prevention efforts. Part 12. The Ripple Effects. The anniversary of David's sentencing arrived with unexpected emotional complexity, bringing both celebration of justice achieved and reflection on the ongoing process of rebuilding my life from the foundation up. 4 years of intensive therapy and personal growth had transformed not just my understanding of what had happened to me, but my entire approach to relationships, work, and life decisions. Agent Chen called that morning to update me on the latest developments in international investigations that had grown from David's case, including the arrest of a major criminal network leader in Germany who had been coordinating theft operations across multiple countries. The continued expansion of the investigation validated the importance of our original case while demonstrating the truly global scope of the criminal enterprise David had participated in. The book I'd been writing about recovery from intimate partner fraud had found a publisher interested in both the personal narrative and the practical information about recognizing and surviving sophisticated manipulation. The writing process had been therapeutic, but also challenging, requiring me to revisit traumatic experiences while maintaining enough emotional distance to provide useful insights for other victims. Marcus and I had reached the point in our relationship where we were discussing moving in together, a milestone that represented significant progress in my ability to trust another person with daily access to my life and possessions. The decision-making process had been deliberately slow and careful, with extensive discussion about boundaries, expectations, and emergency procedures that reflected my hard-won awareness of potential vulnerabilities. The victim support organization where I worked had received federal funding to expand services based partly on the success of programs developed in response to David's case and similar crimes. The funding would allow us to provide longer-term support for victims of sophisticated manipulation while developing prevention and education programs for potential targets of criminal networks. Rebecca's wedding planning had included security measures and background checks for vendors that reflected our family's heightened awareness of potential threats, procedures that might have seemed paranoid before David's crimes, but now felt like reasonable precautions. The wedding itself would be a celebration of genuine love and trust, emotions that felt more valuable considering how fragile trust and intimacy can be after experiencing such systematic manipulation.
Precious, after experiencing their complete absence in David's manufactured relationship. Dr. Park had asked me to co-present research findings at an international conference on psychological manipulation and intimate partner fraud, recognition of the insights I'd developed through my recovery process and advocacy work. The presentation would focus on the extended timeline required for healing from systematic manipulation and the importance of specialized therapeutic approaches for these unique crimes. The support group I'd joined had evolved into advocacy organization, working to improve legal and social services for victims of intimate partner fraud, particularly cases involving sophisticated manipulation techniques that made traditional domestic violence resources insufficient. Our shared experience had created bonds strong enough to fuel ongoing work for systemic change. Financial planning for my future had become more sophisticated as I'd learned about investment strategies and asset protection that could prevent future victimization while building long-term security. The process had been both practical necessity and emotional healing, demonstrating my renewed ability to plan for a future that David had tried to steal along with my present. The recovery of additional stolen jewelry continued sporadically as international investigations progressed, each returned item feeling like receiving an unexpected gift from the past. Some pieces had been altered or damaged during their time in criminal hands, but even imperfect returns carried emotional significance that far exceeded their monetary value. Speaking engagements had expanded beyond law enforcement conferences to include presentations at universities, community organizations, and professional associations interested in understanding sophisticated manipulation techniques and their impact on victims. The presentations had become opportunities to transform my traumatic experience into education that might protect others from similar victimization.
The legal precedents established through David's prosecution had been cited in numerous subsequent cases involving similar crimes, contributing to improved conviction rates and longer sentences for criminals who used romantic manipulation to commit theft and fraud. The ongoing legal impact of our case demonstrated that seeking justice had benefits extending far beyond personal satisfaction. Relationships with extended family members had been affected by David's targeting of our family network, requiring honest conversations about manipulation techniques and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with romantic partners who showed excessive interest in family history or valuable possessions. The discussions had been difficult, but had ultimately strengthened family bonds through shared awareness and mutual protection. The investigation into David's early criminal history had revealed connections to unsolved crimes dating back over a decade, including suspicious deaths that were being re-examined in light of evidence about his poisoning techniques and access to vulnerable victims. The ongoing discoveries meant that the full scope of his criminal career might never be completely known. Marcus's patience with my recovery process and his respect for my need to maintain independence and control had actually strengthened our relationship, creating foundation for trust that felt more solid than anything I'd experienced during my marriage to David. The contrast between manipulation and genuine care had become a touchstone for recognizing healthy relationship dynamics. Part 13. Full Circle. 5 years after discovering David's true nature, I stood before a federal task force training session, sharing insights about victim psychology and recovery that had been gained through my personal experience and professional development in victim advocacy. The audience of investigators and prosecutors represented hope that future victims might receive more effective support and that criminals like David would face swifter justice. The training session focused on recognizing the subtle signs of long-term intimate partner fraud, helping law enforcement officials understand how systematic manipulation differed from traditional domestic violence and required specialized investigation techniques. My role had evolved from victim to expert consultant, a transformation that represented complete recovery of my sense of personal agency and professional competence. Agent Chen had been promoted to lead the federal task force on organized intimate partner fraud. Recognition of her expertise developed during David's investigation and subsequent cases. Her leadership ensured that the investigative techniques and victim support protocols developed during our case would be standardized and implemented across multiple jurisdictions. The book about my experience in recovery had been published to positive reviews from both trauma recovery professionals and general readers, filling a gap in available resources for victims of sophisticated manipulation who needed validation and practical guidance for their healing process. Sales proceeds were being donated to victim support organizations and research into prevention and early detection of similar crimes. Marcus and I had married in a small ceremony that included many of the people who had supported my recovery journey, creating a celebration that honored both our love and the community of authentic relationships that had helped me heal from David's betrayal. The wedding had been planned with careful attention to security, but without the paranoia that had characterized my thinking immediately after David's arrest. The Victim Compensation Fund had provided resources for me to complete graduate school in victim advocacy and counseling, education that had transformed my personal experience into professional expertise that could help other victims navigate their own recovery journeys. The degree represented not just career advancement, but personal triumph over David's attempts to destroy my cognitive abilities and self-confidence. Rebecca's daughter, my niece Emma, had been born into a family network that understood the importance of teaching children about manipulation and boundary setting from
an early age. While we didn't want to create anxiety or paranoia, we recognized the value of age-appropriate education about recognizing and resisting manipulation attempts from people who might try to exploit her trusting nature. The international criminal network that David had participated in had been largely dismantled through coordinated law enforcement efforts, though individual criminals continued operating with modified techniques designed to avoid the detection methods developed during our investigation. The ongoing evolution of both criminal methods and law enforcement responses represented an arms race that would require continued vigilance and adaptation.
Dr. Park had incorporated insights from my recovery process into her therapeutic practice and research, developing improved treatment protocols for victims of long-term intimate partner fraud that addressed the unique challenges of rebuilding trust and identity after systematic manipulation. Her work had contributed to better understanding of the extended recovery timeline required for full healing from these complex crimes. The support group had evolved into a national organization, providing resources and advocacy for victims of intimate partner fraud, with local chapters in major cities offering support groups, legal assistance, and prevention education. The organization's growth reflected increasing recognition of these crimes and the need for specialized services for victims whose experiences didn't fit traditional domestic violence categories. Speaking engagements had expanded internationally as other countries developed their own task forces and specialized units for investigating sophisticated intimate partner fraud. The global nature of these crimes required international cooperation and shared expertise, making my experience relevant to law enforcement and victim advocates worldwide. The recovery of my grandmother's engagement ring had led to the discovery of an entire collection of historical jewelry that had been stolen from families across multiple generations, some pieces dating back over a century. The recovery process had connected me with distant relatives and family historians, creating unexpected relationships and deeper understanding of my heritage that David's theft had initially threatened to sever. Financial security had been restored through a combination of asset recovery, compensation, career advancement, and careful planning, demonstrating that even victims of extensive financial manipulation could rebuild economic stability with appropriate support and professional guidance. The process had required years of effort, but had ultimately provided greater financial literacy and security than I'd possessed before David's crimes. The legal advocacy work had contributed to legislative changes in several states that improved protections for victims of intimate partner fraud and strengthened penalties for criminals who used romantic manipulation to commit theft and other crimes. The changes represented systemic improvements that could protect future victims while ensuring that criminals faced appropriate consequences for their sophisticated manipulation techniques. Marcus's support throughout my advocacy work and continued healing had demonstrated the possibility of maintaining healthy relationships while pursuing demanding career goals and managing ongoing trauma recovery. His understanding of trauma psychology had helped him provide appropriate support without becoming overly protective or limiting my independence and growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.